Thank you, Emily, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
What did you think when you opened the Sunday paper and you saw Mark Zuckerberg's op-ed?
Well, I think it's about time we have this conversation, and we should have been having it before. We have a need to make sure that we are looking at consumer interests and make sure that government is putting appropriate regulations in place. And that's something that hasn't been happening as fast as it needs to. So if that shines a light on it and helps move folks forward, then ultimately that will be a good thing.
Let's unpack his suggestions a little bit, because he talked about new rules governing harmful content, election integrity, privacy, and data portability. And some who looked at this said, well, these are just a tad self-serving, because they said if Facebook is asking the government to determine what is harmful content, what constitutes political advertising, isn't that really a way of them abdicating responsibility and saying, it's not on us anymore?
Well, I think we do have a role to play on the government side to make sure that we are standing up for consumers, standing up for people's rights on privacy, and we do need to define what that is. And it's hard in terms of being clear with specificity. We need to make sure there are rules of the road that all companies can follow, also so that consumers understand what their rights are. Because if it's different every place, they may not understand how they go about protecting information. So I do think there is an important role that government plays in laying that framework, not only in the United States, but there will be global rules in many of these areas, and we need to make sure we're active participants in that.
Well, when it comes to data privacy, again, he also suggested more regulation there, and some folks said, well, that's very nice, Facebook, to suggest that going forward we have restrictions when you have already sucked up so much data, and this would really then, if you limit what everyone else can access, this cements your position of primacy in social media.
Well, a lot of the conversation has been around things like data portability. Can I take my data from one place and move it to another? If I have control of that information, then it wouldn't just be something that is controlled by an individual organization, but something that I can move and take where I want it to go. To make sure that any sensitive information that I have that I'm able to control, and you have to ask for my consent, assume that I have to opt in, as opposed to the assumption that I have kind of by default opted into something.
Which is what it is today.
Which is what it is today. That needs to change. I think it's critically important that people are making conscious decisions about what happens to their personal information, and that it's clear to them on what might happen to their information. And that definitely puts guidelines around what any company could do with that information. Because we've seen that people are seeing information used in ways they never anticipated, and that absolutely needs to change.
Now, it sounds like what you're describing are some of the facets of your legislation, which you reintroduced last week, and that was the Information Transparency and Personal Data Control Act. So as we move forward, is that what you think we should follow when it comes to some sort of nationwide data privacy law?
Well, I think it's a great start. We need to make sure that privacy is the default, that people have clear information what happens to their data. One core tenet of the legislation is that things have to be in clear language so that someone can actually read how their information would be used and be able to make a decision.
That thing that went on and on that was paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. You have to read that no one does, and you just check the box and go on to what you want.
People just say accept, in fact, and many times don't even try to read it. That is a place where now people have, one, they didn't understand how information would be used, and sometimes it wasn't clear there. I think if we have a policy that makes sure that has to be clear, and that people have to opt in, make the decision that they are going to allow their data to be used, I think that's an important combination. Two things that I talk about in my legislation, but Also, we need to have enforcement. And when we think about it from a federal government standpoint, who is going to provide this enforcement and to make sure that these regulations really stick?
Who do you propose?
And I propose that that's the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, that we would give them resources so they can make rules with respect to how these policies would be implemented, but also could be an enforcement agency on these rules. Because, you know, what does it mean to have something in clear language, and how do we make sure that someone's really following that? We need someone to be able to make sure that things are clear, put guidelines in place, et cetera. So that's another key tenet of the legislation I think will be critical to make sure that we're successful moving forward.
Is the FTC ready to step up to the plate on that?
Well, I propose in my bill that we provide additional resources because we just don't have the resources right now, either the right type of, you know, of talent to be able to tackle these issues, but just also people to do the work.
Mm-hmm. How is your legislation similar to or different from, say, GDPR in Europe or California's measure?
Well,
or the one your own state of Washington is considering,
and
right?
our state is looking, you know, I think, first of all, states have moved forward on legislation in the absence of any progress at the federal level. We should have a national standard. I think that's incredibly important. We've seen the EU move forward with GDPR, and that becomes kind of the rules of the road, even for many other countries, in the absence of the US taking a stand and putting policy in place. And we are leaders in a lot of innovation. We should be really thoughtful and showing leadership too on standards in this way. So it's not just a domestic issue, it is an international issue. We look at trade agreements. We have digital trade. I'm a co-founder of the Digital Trade Caucus. If we're going to talk about these issues and have a global standard, we should be providing leadership there. And right now we're not. And so a national standard is important, not only so consumers know what happens to their information and know there's consistent rules across the country, but also that we are putting forward policies that can be used in international agreements and be used to help inform global standards.
What kind of a chance do you think your legislation has, especially now that we have people like Zuckerberg coming out and saying we need some rules, we need some regulation?
Well, I think, you know, one of the challenges that we've had in Congress is, you know, a lot of our issues on technology haven't been, folks haven't been sure how to tackle them. It's not so much that they're partisan issues, it's that they're cover areas that a lot of people don't have familiarity with and expertise in, and so they're afraid to move forward in the absence of kind of understanding the implications of any policy decision.
And
so,
you've been trying to push forward just simple changes in the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, passed in '86. I mean, dare we say that's just a tad out of date? And so if you can't pass just an update to that, how do you pass something this week?
Well, the simple update to that has come up in Congress ever since I've been in Congress and actually has passed the House is something called the Email Privacy Act, which basically says that digital information, emails that are stored up in the cloud should have the same warrant protections that a piece of paper would have in your file drawer. That's legislation passed the House, didn't pass the Senate. We need to take another run at it this Congress. But that's very simple compared to some of the other issues we need to tackle. And so it is unfortunate that we haven't made progress there. And as you said, here we have laws from 1986. A lot has changed since then. I worked on the early days of email
at
back
Microsoft,
in 1989, right? And those were the early days of email. So that was before the law was even passed before that happened. So now we have a very old, outdated law, and the world is changing quickly in many ways, and we need to keep up. And so it's important that we start having these conversations, that we move forward on legislation, and that we talk about these issues. And my bill, I've talked to many stakeholders on my privacy bill to put that good foundation in place. But let's have a robust debate, and let's move forward on these issues, and privacy is a good place. Email Privacy Act is probably one of the simplest areas we could start with, too.
So how do you, though, educate your fellow lawmakers? I know the tech-savvy ones among you are trying, but when you have so many who really don't understand the basic technology involved, are not familiar with the platforms, how can you really have regulations and oversight that's comprehensive and effective?
Well, first, education is really important, and so I've tried to create a few different areas where I can help educate my colleagues, not only Digital Trade Caucus, I helped start up the Internet of Things Caucus. We have and
members are joining?
And members join, and it's members and staff for us to be able to give people information on what technologies are out there today, where things might be headed, issues that you should keep in mind, so that we can help make sure that people have kind of those kind of basic foundation that's going to be necessary when we talk about policy. I'm also part of a committee that we just started this Congress called the Select Committee to Modernize Congress.
Excuse me?
And the Select Committee, one of the things we can do is also talk about how we make sure there are resources, whether it's staff or others who can help members of Congress as we tackle these issues, folks to go to get information, not necessarily partisan, just folks to go to get information on issues. So that's going to be important there. But yes, we have other things we need to tackle. We talk about modernizing Congress, but we have a bipartisan committee talking about that now, and that's a very important step.
Today is Equal Pay Day. How concerned are you, excuse me, about the lack of diversity in the Silicon Valley and the effect that has on the products that they produce? And is there anything that you can, or Congress can and should do, to encourage more women being elevated to positions of leadership there?
Well, I think this is a very important issue. I'm also a co-chair of the Women's High Tech Coalition, so we can get more women involved and young women involved in STEM and technology. There's things we need to do across the board in terms of making sure that young people are getting access to the kind of core elements they need at the beginning, early education. We have things like Hour of Code that are out there to help people just get exposed to computer programming, even if they're not going to become a programmer, just to make sure they understand the concepts, and it can be presented as a problem solving, something fun to tackle. But we also know that that it's hard to get into a field if you don't picture yourself there. Right. You don't see potential mentors or others Role that make models. You feel like you can succeed there. And this is a big, very, very important issue for us to continue to tackle. I think that if you are going, from a business perspective, if you're going to be successful, you need folks who represent the opportunities that are out there. And many diverse communities can talk about how products would be used in different cultures by different people. And that's incredibly important if you're going to design products that are going to be successful all around the world. So I think there absolutely should be the business incentive. And I think that we collectively, this is a important issue for all of us to tackle, need to push to make a difference. But definitely in terms of getting young people engaged and making sure we realize that technology isn't just technology companies. It is foundation. I'd say it's infrastructure for almost any type of business now. And so that understanding and skill set is going to be important in so many different types of careers. And we need to make sure that young people have that exposure and that opportunity.
Well, I'd like to give the audience a chance to jump in here. I have a lot of questions of my own, but I know you probably have many yourselves. So, and if you don't raise your hands soon, I'm just going to keep on going.
You can give
we got one right here.
Too,
and if you would identify yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Joe Reddix. One of the things I've been looking at over the years is not just fake news, but fake data. And it's becoming extremely hard to cleanse fake data, which could lead to a whole lot of situations, whether it's an election-related issue or whatever. What kind of guidelines do you feel government can produce to minimize or punish the issuance of people who or organizations that create fake data?
Great question.
I think one thing that's going to be critically important is transparency, making sure people know where information's coming from, who provided that information, how it got online, kind of the history of how it appeared online. This is when we talk about things like articles and what's happened in elections. One of the biggest thing that came up is people don't know where information came from, or it came through organizations that tried to sell themselves as a different type of organization they actually were. There's legislation in Congress on ads to make sure we have transparency on where ads come from on the political side, just like we've had on television for a long time, but we haven't done the same in the online world. Again, so people can look at where information's coming from and make a decision about whether they feel like that is coming from a reliable source or not. It's an important issue, and it's a difficult issue. So it's going to take making sure that we have transparency. It's also going to take people at all levels and within organizations to work on this issue so people know where the information is coming from and can then make a judgment about whether they're going to rely on that information or not.
All right. Another question? Okay. A couple right here.
Hi, my name's Christina Fitzpatrick. I'm with AARP. Some of the industry folks have called for the government to release their data so that all the data that they collect to make their algorithms work better and sort of realize the benefits that, that having a lot of data can provide. I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
Well, I think that this is part of the challenge that, and an important part of the conversation, because there are benefits when you are able to take data, especially if it's anonymous data that put together. Healthcare is a good example. We see a lot of great work happening in healthcare where you can take large volumes of data and see that maybe one type of cancer is actually, when you look at the data in detail, is actually 5 different kinds, and they can be treated different ways and have more successful outcomes. Part of that is pulling that data together. And so the important part is, how do you make sure that there's not personal information attached to that data is anonymized and people are protected in that way, so that we can kind of use data where appropriate to help solve problems like cancer, but also make sure that people's personal information is protected, and we need to, the kind of rules need to be clarifying on how that is anonymized to make sure that people can't backtrack and find out something personal about someone.
All right, great. I think we have time for one more question. There was a young lady right here. There we go.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Samantha Schwartz. I'm a reporter with CIO Dive, and I was wondering if Washington State had any, data privacy laws that are in the working, like California.
Yes, in fact, there is in the state legislature right now in Washington State, and I think that we'll continue to see states move forward on data privacy laws and other issues on data breaches, et cetera. Sometimes people have been combining these in the absence of the federal government moving forward. And I think it's important that we have federal legislation here, but I also know that states will move forward and in the absence of the federal government moving, and absolutely they should do that. And we should do a good job in the federal side of putting together national policy.
Thank you very much. And Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for your wonderful questions.